Good evening, everyone. Welcome to this, our first installment of our study on the ends. And this evening, we'll be looking at the book of First Timothy. Now, First Timothy is one of those books that have been given to us through the Church of God in Jamaica as topics of our studies. And so, for the next few weeks, we'll be looking at First Timothy. Now, the first thing I want us to note is that this is the final series of letters that Paul has written. And along with Second Timothy and Titus, this letter is known as one of the pastoral epistles. Now, First Timothy offers to us practical and pastoral advice from an aging apostle who is Paul to a young pastor, Timothy, working in the church there at Ephesus. And we know that Paul and Timothy's path joined more than a decade previously when Paul met Timothy in the city of Lystra, where Timothy was a known and respected young Christian. Right? We know this from Acts chapter 16. And if we read verses 1 to 4, we will get this understanding. But upon recognizing Timothy's impressive qualities, Paul recruited him to travel with him as he continued his second missionary journey. Now, to learn a little bit about Timothy, I want for us to get an idea of who Timothy was. Timothy grew up with a pagan, or what in the day would be called a Greek father, and he had a Jewish mother. His mother and grandmother taught him the scriptures, but Timothy didn't know that Jesus was the promised Messiah until the rabbi, Paul the apostle, came to town. Now, what was happening at the time? Now, you see, Paul had healed a man who had been lame from birth and preached the gospel there, right? And after doing this, Paul was stoned by a mob and dragged out of the city, and he was thought to be dead. But in an amazing feat of strength, Paul got up and went back into the city the next day and courageously strengthened those who believed. And the important thing is that Paul, in this Acts chapter 14 and verse 22 passage, or verse, he said, through many tribulations, the child of God must enter into the kingdom of heaven. And so, for those of us who are children of God and believe that the kingdom of heaven is something for us to just enjoy, and there is no difficulties that we will face, and there is no trials and tribulation. Understand that from early out, Timothy knew that he was going to face much trials and tribulation because of his newfound faith. Timothy was one who had believed. In the years that followed, he grew in the Lord and was highly regarded by the church because of his ministry in the local church. And so Paul came back to Lystra a second time, and this time he invited Timothy to join him in his itinerant ministry. Itinerant really means, preaching here and there, not necessarily pastor in a particular church, but just being a preacher who moves from place to place, preaching the gospel of Jesus Christ. As a matter of fact, there are many persons who prefer this kind of ministry, separate and apart from being a minister in a local church, right? And so Paul told Timothy to join him in this itinerant ministry. And many of us would say, boy, what an opportunity to travel and to serve with the Apostle Paul himself, this courageous man of God who had years before led Timothy to Christ. By now, some scholars believe Timothy was in his 20s and Paul would have been in his 50s, right? And for the next 18 or so years, Paul and Timothy would serve the church, and Timothy would serve Paul as a devoted son would serve his father. And so I want for us to now look a little bit more on the young man Timothy, a faithful servant of the Apostle Paul and a faithful servant of Christ. Let's go to looking a little bit more on Timothy, right? Um, it is to Timothy that the letter that Paul wrote here was sent. And Paul never referred to Timothy without affection in his voice. Timothy, as young as he was, had become one of the ornaments of the Christian church in Lystra. Some scholars believe, like I said earlier, some believe he was in his 20s, some believe he was in his 30s. And based on Paul's comment in uh, Philippians, in chapter 4, sorry, of this Timothy book. Don't let anyone look down on you because you are young, but set an example for the believers in speech, in life, in love, in purity, and in faith. Right? Some believe that Timothy would have been in his early 30s or somewhere in his late 20s. John Stott, renowned Bible scholar, describes Timothy as temperamentally shy, needing affection, encouragement, and reassurance. And I want you to remember that because there is a question that I will pose to you at the end of this evening study that I want for you to contemplate and be able to give an answer when we meet together tomorrow, right? So John Stott, I will repeat, describes him as temperamentally shy, needing affection, encouragement, and reassurance. And John Stott draws from chapter uh, 1 and verse 7. And I am going to just read that very quickly. Um, that for God did not give us a spirit of timidity, but a spirit of love and of self-discipline. And the King James Version that many of us enjoy reading would say, He has not given us a spirit of fear, but of love and of power and a sound mind. And so, based on this, and based also on the fact that Timothy was seen as someone who suffered from a recurrent stomach problem. We see this in First Timothy chapter 5 and verse 23 when Paul says to him, don't drink water alone, but drink a little wine for your stomach's sake because you are always ill, right? And remember now, I don't want us to use this verse as an excuse for anybody drinking alcohol or strong drink. We know that many of the medicines that we have today and back in that day had a little alcohol in it. And so Paul was really saying to Timothy that probably one of the potions that he would drink from time to time to settle his stomach, whatever that stomach issue might have been, Paul was actually saying to him to not drink water alone, but to take a little bit of that to ensure that his stomach was settled because of this issue. But in spite of John Stott saying he was temperamentally shy and needed encouragement, despite the fact that he was physically weak and suffered a recurrent stomach problem, there is a charm and enthusiasm in young Timothy that the people spoke well of him to Paul. And Paul, when he needed an assistant, said, This is the man. And he worked along with Timothy all these years. And so Paul trained Timothy into being the pastor that he believed would have been able to work with the church there at Ephesus. And we're going to talk a little bit about that as we continue on, because we will see that the church at Ephesus was not an easy church, and several things was happening. And so we will be getting to that. So Paul decided that he would overlook some of those other things if they were serious issues, and he would train Timothy. There is a thing for us to recognize, that Paul was being a mentor to this young man. And so, this business of mentoring our youth into being strong, bold Christians is something that is stemming from long time in scripture, and we will talk a little bit about that even as we continue on. Paul, for Paul, the virtues of Timothy outnumbered all the other things that might have happened. Now, one of the things that we see happening in this mentoring of Timothy is that Paul also went ahead and circumcised Timothy. Remember now, earlier we said Timothy was a child of a mixed marriage. His mother was a Jewess and his father was a Greek. And so Timothy would have been uncircumcised. And we see this in Acts chapter 16. Now, Paul did not circumcise Timothy because he was a slave to the law, or did he never saw circumcision as having any special virtue. But he knew well that if Timothy was going to work among the Jews, there would be some level of prejudice against him if he was uncircumcised. And so he took this step as a practical measure to increase Timothy's usefulness as an evangelist. Now, there is something to be said about this, because many of us do not understand that sometimes, even if we are doing something that may not necessarily be going against our spirituality and so on, but for the mere fact that it will cause us to be more useful as a messenger of the gospel, that we should do this. What do I mean by this, you may ask? And I'll tell you. For me, I will be going to certain parts of the island to preach. And I know that there are some churches that are very strict on how they dress and so on. And so I don't believe that in order to preach the gospel, I need to be in a jacket and tie and so on. I can preach the gospel in a jeans and a t-shirt, and I will be just as effective. However, dependent on my audience, I will ensure that I put on a suit and tie, because I am more useful in proclaiming the gospel, because my dress does not become a deterrent or a distraction. And so there's nothing wrong spiritually, there's nothing sinful about the dress, without the tie or in a jeans or whatever. But the fact is, you will be more useful, and sometimes we need to look at that part of it, that in order to be more useful, I may need to look at my audience and look at the people with which I am interacting and seek to work along with them. All right. I'm sure when we meet to discuss, there may be something there that we might want to pick up on and discuss. It is important to note that the practice of circumcision as an expectation of the Jewish Christians and non-Christians was a thorny issue in the early church, and it really caused a lot of conflicts at the time. And then you look at the book of Galatians, you will see Paul addressing this issue because it became so thorny an issue. Right? But Paul circumcised Timothy, and Timothy became Paul's trusted lieutenant. Right? He continued as Paul's companion from the moment he joined him on his second missionary journey. Paul was left behind at Berea with Silas. Right? Paul escaped to Athens and later joined Timothy there. We see this in Acts 17. Paul was then sent as Timothy, rather, was sent as Paul's emissary. He was sent as his messenger to Macedonia. and Timothy was there when the collection from the churches was being taken to Jerusalem. He was with Paul in Corinth when Paul wrote his letter to Rome, right? And we see this in Romans 16 and verse 21 when Paul said, Timothy sends his greetings also, right? Paul, and he was Paul's emissary or messenger to Corinth. There, when there was trouble in the unruly church, and Paul wrote the First Corinthians letter, he was with Paul when Paul wrote the second book of Corinthians, and we see this in Corinthians, Second Corinthians chapter 1, verses 1 and verse 19. It was Timothy who Paul sent to evaluate issues in the church at Thessalonica when he was with Paul, and he was with Paul when he wrote this letter to the Thessalonians, right? Paul and Timothy was believed to be in prison at Philippi. When you read Philippians chapter 1 and verse 1, Paul talks about Timothy and I, you know, and Paul, we know, was writing this letter from a prison cell. And so we see that Timothy was right there alongside Paul in much of his work during the years, both when times were good and when times were not so good. Timothy was also with Paul when he wrote to the church at Colossus and to Philemon. Timothy was constantly by Paul's side. And when Paul had a very difficult job to do, Timothy was the man that he chose to send to do it. Many times we see Timothy being the emissary of Paul. Now, watch this, watch this. Remember earlier we said Timothy was this shy, you know, introverted young man, and Paul was bolstering and telling him, don't be afraid, don't fear. And Paul really encouraged him this way. But yet still, the difficult jobs that Paul had to do, Paul sent Timothy. Over and over again, Paul's voice vibrates with affection when he speaks of Timothy, and he speaks to him with such passion and such love. And at the same time, he trusts him with some of the hardest tasks that he have to do, right? And I want you to just hear Paul in First Corinthians chapter 4 and verse 17. I want to find it. First Corinthians chapter 4 and verse 17. Here Paul speaking of Timothy. For this reason I am sending to you Timothy, my son, whom I love, who is faithful in the Lord. He will remind you of my way of life in Christ Jesus, which agrees with what I teach everywhere in every church. You hear that? That is how Paul spoke of this young man, Timothy. When Paul was planning to send Timothy to Philippi, he wrote, I have no one like him, right? Paul trusted this young man, and he knew very well that Timothy would be able to work through the difficult things. He sees him as a true son, right? And when Paul uses this word that he sees him as a true son, it has two meanings in the Greek. One, it was normal word used for a legitimate child, right? And at the same time, it was a word used for being genuine as opposed to being counterfeit. So Paul was saying, this is a genuine soldier. This is a genuine child of God. This is a trusted lieutenant. I can depend upon this man. And so I ask you this evening, even as we contemplate this introduction to First Timothy, could you be called a trusted lieutenant? Could you be called a true son or daughter of the Lord Jesus Christ? Are you genuine as opposed to being counterfeit? Could God count upon you and call you my true daughter, my true son. Now, next week, we will look at the purpose for which the book is written. And I want for you to read ahead and read the first chapter, but focus particularly on verse 3 of chapter 1, right? And be able for us to talk about that for a moment. But for this week, and when we meet tomorrow, I want for you to look at a few questions that we could discuss. Do you think John Stott is right when he interprets and says Timothy was shy and needed affection and so on because of his interpretation of Second Timothy chapter 1 verse 7, right? Um, if it is that you agree with John Stott that Timothy was a little shy and so on, then the question you'll have to ask is, why then did Paul um, ask, consider Timothy to be his trusted assistant? The next thing that I want for us to contemplate and be able to talk about is how should potential leaders in our churches be identified and how should mentoring be carried out? And lastly, yes, we want to try to understand what was in the mind of Paul when he called Timothy his true son. What do you think Paul meant? And finally, I want us to talk about this one. Think about it and tell me what you think about it, man. Should Paul have circumcised Timothy, or should he have just insisted that the people accept Timothy for who he is, seeing that circumcision was not necessary for salvation? If circumcision is not necessary for salvation, why circumcise the young man? And the fact of the matter is, we would can imagine that it circumcising someone that age is a lot more difficult, a lot more painful, and take a lot more time to heal than if it were that Timothy was circumcised as a babe when the Jewish children would have been circumcised. These are some things I want for you to contemplate and to let us talk about when we meet tomorrow. Write them down, right? Put your questions down, put your answers down. Let me hear what you're thinking. And next week we will pick up on our study. Thank you so much for joining us on this first episode of Study on the Endz. God bless you. And I trust that you will join me tomorrow as we go through the discussion phase of this study. God bless.